They said the earliest waffles were not meant to be eaten for pleasure. They began as something quieter, bits of dough pressed between heavy irons in small chapels, where the only sounds were footsteps on stone and the soft hiss of burning coals. The irons bore crosses, doves, and scenes of scripture. When they closed, the dough flattened into thin white discs meant for communion, not hunger, a bread of ritual, made in silence. But as centuries passed, those same irons changed hands. Blacksmiths carved new designs into them, flowers, shields, patterns shaped like honeycomb. And in markets from Paris to Bruges, the scent drifting from the irons grew warmer. Grain, butter, and the faint sweetness of spice. By the time England reached the early 1700s, wafers had travelled far from the altars where they began. They had become treats, sold on crowded streets, carried between countries, reshaped by each kitchen that adopted them. And in 1714 they crossed yet another threshold. England borrowed a Dutch word, waffle, along with a new way of preparing the batter. Yeast replaced stillness, cream replaced water, nutmeg replaced simplicity. And a wafer, once used in devotion, began to rise into something softer, richer, and unmistakably new. No one at the time would have called it the first modern waffle, but in kitchens warmed by early morning fires, the change had already begun, quietly, like most things that endure. For centuries, the irons that once pressed communion wafers remained close to the rituals that had shaped them. But as Europe changed, so did the hands that held those irons. By the 1200s, wafer sellers filled the markets of Paris. They carried long-handled irons carved with vines, shields, and simple geometric patterns. When they set those irons over charcoal braziers, the scent of warmed grain drifted between the stalls. Thin, crisp wafers, cooked quickly, stacked in bundles, sold to anyone with a coin or two to spare. Their wafers varied. Some were sweetened with honey, some carried ginger or spice. Some were made without eggs or dairy so they could be eaten during Lent. And a few were prepared with fillings, cheese pressed between layers of batter, or mixtures flavored with herbs. Their popularity grew so quickly that sellers began to crowd one another. Arguments over space turned to shoving matches, and shoving matches sometimes turned to blows. In 1560, the king himself intervened, ordering that wafer vendors keep a safe distance apart, at least 2 toises, roughly 6 feet, especially on feast days when tempers flared and the streets grew tight with people. The wafers still carried the faint memory of their sacred origin, but their world was no longer one of quiet chapels. It was one of noise, barter, laughter, and quarrel, the ordinary life of cities. And in that shift from ritual to marketplace, the path toward the modern waffle quietly opened. Farther north, in the Low Countries, another change was taking place. Cooks there began to add yeast, sometimes drawn from ale making, into their wafer batter. The mixture thickened, rose, and demanded irons deeper than those used for the older, flatter wafers. Blacksmiths responded. They forged irons with broad grids and deeper pockets, patterns that held heat and shaped the batter into raised squares. When these irons closed, the batter steamed instead of simply crisping. The result was lighter, richer, and far more substantial than the thin rounds sold in Paris. By the late 1500s, cookbooks in Antwerp described these new creations in detail. They called for warm cream, melted butter, fine flour, yeast, and as many as a dozen egg yolks. The batter was thick enough to spoon, not pour, a sign of how far it had drifted from its ceremonial ancestor. Around the same time, paintings began to show waffles that resembled those we know today, risen, patterned, and golden at the edges. Some were flavored with cardamom, others with wine. A few rare versions included chocolate, an expensive novelty at the time. Across Northern Europe, waffles became tied to seasons and celebrations. In the Nordic countries, they were eaten on the Feast of the Annunciation, a tradition born from a linguistic twist that turned All Ladies' Day into Waffle Day. In England, they appeared at sheep-shearing feasts, shared among neighbours after long days in the fields. The irons grew heavier, the batter grew richer, and slowly the waffle took on the form that would travel beyond Europe. When the Dutch style reached England in 1714, it did not arrive as a novelty. It arrived as a recipe, carried by merchants, noted by cooks, and gradually incorporated into English household traditions. One recipe from that year preserves the moment. It calls for eggs, sugar, nutmeg, cream, flour, melted butter, rose water, and yeast. Nothing unusual on its own, but together these ingredients formed a batter unlike the thin wafers of earlier English tradition. It was richer, heavier, and meant to rise, a direct reflection of Dutch influence shaped within an English kitchen. When cooked in the deeper irons that had begun appearing in England, the batter produced something new for the English palate, a raised, patterned cake that sat between bread and pastry, far removed from the crisp wafers sold in medieval markets. But what mattered most was not the batter. It was the language. The Dutch word waffle entered English cookbooks at this moment, becoming waffle, and with it England recorded in its own language the method, texture, and form that the Low Countries had developed. This mattered because English was the language that would cross the Atlantic. In the decades that followed, the English version, thick batter, yeast, deep irons, travelled to the American colonies. It became the basis for waffle frolics, for community gatherings, and eventually for the waffles that America would carry into the modern age. The invention was Dutch, but in 1714, England unknowingly became the bridge that allowed it to spread, a quiet adoption that shaped the form the waffle would take for centuries to come. As European families sailed to the Americas, they carried with them the foods they hoped not to lose. Among them were iron molds, carefully wrapped and tucked into trunks, meant for the waffles of home. In the New World, those waffles found new life. By the mid-1700s, colonies along the eastern seaboard hosted gatherings called waffle frolics. These were part feast, part social ritual, evenings where neighbors crowded into warm kitchens as waffles were cooked one by one over fire. A Yale student in 1744 described such a gathering, noting the games that preceded the meal and the steady rhythm of waffles emerging from the iron. It was a simple pleasure, made special by the effort required. The tradition lasted for generations. By the early 1900s, waffle parties had become refined affairs. One social manual from 1907 described invitations that resembled small waffle squares, padded with cotton to mimic their texture and lightly browned with the hot iron. Printed across them were the words, "Come and eat me." Guests arrived in high spirits. 2 people were always stationed at the iron, 1 to grease, 1 to cook, and waffles were served throughout the night, each round greeted with anticipation. Electric irons appeared in 1911, offering relief to tired arms and a hint of modern convenience.
But the gatherings continued, shaped by the same warmth that had defined them in earlier centuries. The waffle had crossed an ocean, and in doing so, it had become part of American hospitality, a bridge between old customs and new lives.
In 1953, in San Jose, California, the waffle changed once again, not in flavor, but in form. Frank Dorser and his brothers sought a way to freeze waffles so they could be reheated quickly without losing their structure. Families were busier now. Mornings were shorter. A waffle that required neither iron nor fire seemed like something worth pursuing. They succeeded. Their frozen waffle, first called a frazzle, held its shape when reheated in a toaster. The name did not last, but the product did. Soon it took on the name of their company, Eggo, and became a fixture of American breakfasts. For the first time, waffles were no longer tied to a specific skill or tool. No rising batter, no long-handled irons, no smoke from charcoal or wood. Just a slot in a toaster and a few minutes of quiet heat. It was a departure from the centuries-long craft that had defined waffles in Europe and colonial kitchens. Yet it fit the pace of the era, an age that valued convenience and consistency. The waffle, once shaped by fire and patience, had entered the modern world. Across its long history, the waffle's pattern became more than decoration. It became memory. The shallow designs of early communion irons remain echoed in the smallest squares. The floral and heraldic carvings from medieval markets survive in the geometric order of the grid. The deep pockets created by Belgian smiths carry the promise of steam and lift still found in modern batter. Even ingredients carry their own lineage. Nutmeg, traded across seas, once marked the height of luxury. Rosewater hints at older European kitchens. Cream and butter speak of feast days and gatherings. Yeast links bakers and brewers who shared knowledge long before recipes were written down. A modern waffle may appear simple, crisp, warm, quickly eaten, but it holds the weight of centuries. Today, waffles sit on breakfast plates with little ceremony. They are eaten quickly, often without considering the long road that brought them there. But history leaves traces, even in quiet foods. The waffle's journey began in devotion, a thin disk pressed in silence. It moved into the markets of medieval Europe, where sellers argued over narrow spaces, and the scent of warmed grain drifted through crowded streets. It rose higher in the Low Countries, lifted by yeast and shaped by deep irons. It crossed into England in 1714, gathering new flavours and a new name. It sailed to America, where it became a tradition shared between neighbours, and it entered the modern age through a toaster in California. Each stage left something behind, a pattern, a flavour, a memory. The past does not always survive in monuments. Sometimes it survives in the simplest things. A grid of iron, a hint of spice, a food shaped by hands long gone. A waffle is humble, but the history it carries is not. And for those who look closely, its pattern still holds the quiet echo of the centuries that made it, one square at a time.